All right, class, today is going to be our Chapter 6 lecture on population and community ecology. When we study populations and communities, we're basically going to be talking about not just individual numbers, but we're going to be looking at rates of growth, distributions, age disparities, and a number of other things related to studying individuals in their ecosystems. So the case study the book gives is about New England forests, which are an example of not just distribution, but also competition and how these organisms interacted with each other for space and for light, because most of New England's forests were deforested in order to create farmland, in order to build houses by the early settlers and pilgrims, that by about 1850, 80% of those New England forests had been gone. But once the farms were abandoned and people started working in factories and textiles, the land became prone to succession, where since it was not being treated or cared for by humans anymore, natural growth and natural competition was allowed to take over. So what used to be large, tall trees was converted into farmland. Eventually, we started to see different plants making their way back. Smaller plants, grasses, goldenrods they mentioned specifically as a highly competitive plant species in this area, paved the way for larger plants and then eventually trees to make their way back, and tree seeds to eventually grow and reach maturity and almost resemble the original forest to a certain extent. Now, to review some of the terminology and things, we're going to be focusing on population dynamics and community dynamics. Basically, populations being individuals of a single species, and communities being individuals of many species interacting with each other. So, what are the factors that determine abundance, how many, and distribution where we find all these individuals? So we look at 4 different things. 3 of these we're going to really focus on in this chapter. The other ones, sex ratio and age structure, are going to pop up in a later lecture. But population size is just how many individuals in an area at a given time. That's how we measure the population size. Different from population density, which is basically the population size expressed over a unit area, meaning the state of New Jersey is a good example for studying size versus density. In terms of population size, we're not as big as some of the other larger states, which have much greater populations in terms of sheer number. But in terms of states, we're at one of the most dense, if not the most dense state right now, in terms of how many people we have in our small area that defines our state of New Jersey. So you can have a large population size but a low population density, or vice versa. So we do have to use those 2 pieces of data differently. And the third thing we're going to look at the beginning of this lecture is population distribution, which is just how individuals are distributed in that community, in that area, with respect to one another. So here are some examples of population distribution. So there are 3 basic ones we use in ecology. We have random distribution, uniform distribution, and clumps. So you see here that trees growing in a forest here is an example of random distribution. They fall wherever the seeds grow. There's no rhyme or reason as to where those organisms are being found. So the particular trees that are being studied here appear to be these orangish ones, are very randomly spread out here. There's no real mechanism to determine how or why they're spread out where they are. So we'd call that random. Uniform distribution, so if you look at the gulls here are all competing, or all individual organisms, and they all are kind of almost uniformly distributed in terms of rows and arrangements, so that they have an even amount of space for this nesting area that they have. So uniform distribution is when we would find organisms fairly evenly spread out from one another. Maybe not perfect lines, but definitely has a pattern to it to keep evenness. In clump distribution, we tend to see in larger organisms or mammals, things that tend to be pack animals or family type of animals that have that kind of structure to them, where in these areas we're going to find a group of organisms clumped or very close together with a large amount of space between them and that next clump of organisms. So that's how we find our distribution. So we talked about population size and population density. So what are the things that determine population size? Well, we've got 2 things that we're going to focus on. I shouldn't say 2 things, but 2 classes really. we have density-dependent factors and we have density-independent factors. So as you can tell just from the name, density-dependent factors would be something that are going to impact how much or how well an individual can survive. That depends on how many individuals that are there. That depends on the density of that population. So the size of the population does influence survival, whereas a density-independent factor means that the size of the population has no effect on probability for survival. So some things that we would normally consider limiting factors or limiting resources, so things like food, water, space, those can be examples of density-dependent factors where if you have a larger population or a more dense population, then food is going to be limited. So the size there is going to limit how much food an individual can get, which is going to have an influence on survival. Density-independent factors are things that doesn't matter if you have 1, 10, 100, or 1,000 individuals, that factor, that thing, has no change in its has no effect on that individual's probability for survival. It's the same no matter how many individuals are there. Good example of these are things like natural disasters, so earthquakes, floods, tornadoes. Doesn't matter if you have one tree of a species or 1,000 trees. If a tornado rips through that area and rips up the entire ground and all of the living producers that are there, all of the trees, it doesn't matter if there was 1 or 1,000, it had no effect on what that tornado would have done to an individual's survival. So that's just an example of density-independent factors. So in order to look at, and when we study populations, we study them at different periods of time, meaning that if we keep track of those things, we can track growth. So in ecology, we study growth a couple of different ways. We always look at the growth rate. So when we look at individual populations over time, we can study growth rate. How much has it grown or declined? Because growth is basically just births minus deaths. So when we look at these individuals, we can see, well, what is the growth rate? Was it, how did the births equal out with the number of deaths, which would keep a steady population? If births are much greater than the number of deaths, we have population growth. And if deaths are greater than births, then we have a population decline. Now, in order to study growth, we have to know what ideal growth, or what we call intrinsic growth, would look like. So under ideal conditions, we can look at, when you have no limiting factors, how a population could grow, and then use that information to compare to actual growth in a population. So intrinsic growth rate gives us an idea of what it could potentially be. So we have this formula here that creates this J-shaped exponential growth model. And it's this NT equals N0 times e to the RT power. So what do all of those things mean? Well, NT is going to be our future population size, basically what we're trying to figure out. N0 is the original size of the population at a particular time. Now, since it's an exponential growth model, we're going to be using e, which is the base of the natural log, roughly 2.72 in terms of a numerical value, because we know that if we take e and we start to take it to different powers, which would represent exponential growth, hence the exponents here, that's going to give us this J-shaped curve. And so those exponents that we factor in are the intrinsic growth rate r and time t. Basically, how much can the population actually grow? What is the, given that there are no limiting factors, what would the growth rate be? And t being time. So how much time are we analyzing over it? And in class, we'll go over a couple examples of this. We'll do some math problems with this sometime in the near future after this lecture is concluded. Now, logistic growth is what we would call more realistic growth. So this is what actually happens in nature. Basically, since we have limiting resources, populations cannot grow to infinity. Since we have these limiting resources, populations will grow until they reach what we call the carrying capacity, which we represent with the letter K. So because they're going to grow exponentially and then eventually hit that capacity, that carrying capacity, or that ceiling, eventually the population growth will level off and the growth will become 0 and the population numbers will remain steady, which, based on the J curve hitting a ceiling, would create an S shape, so we call logistic growth an S curve. So here we see that early growth is exponential, but as we approach the carrying capacity, our perfect logistic growth model starts to level off, creating this S shape here. Now, logistic model doesn't perfectly hit that carrying capacity and stop. There's usually fluctuation. There's going to be an overshoot and a die-off for the most part with logistic growth, where after it reaches the carrying capacity, the environment will start putting selective pressure on these organisms, saying, hey, there isn't enough of this limiting resource, whether it's space, whether it's food, whether it's water, or whether there's just too many individuals that can be predated on, which will in turn grow the population of a predator, like we saw with the lynx in the hare lab. And eventually you get these overshoots and die-offs, which as the population grows, or as the population continues to have offspring and births and deaths over time, eventually these overshoots and die-offs become less severe, and it will just kind of hover around the carrying capacity for the most part, unless there's some other major disturbance or activity that occurs. So what determines these growth rates? Well, we have a couple of different species that we can categorize these organisms into. We have K-selected species and R-selected species. Now, when we talk about these reproductive strategies, it depends on the organism. So K-selected species, when in terms of logistic growth, will grow slowly until they reach the carrying capacity. These are organisms that usually don't have a lot of offspring, so there's not going to be a lot of overshoot, if any. So these organisms, you won't see as much overshoot. They'll just kind of hover closer to the carrying capacity, kind of like this model here, with a little bit of overshoot and die-off. The R-selected species are the ones that are going to have more exponential growth and are going to have a lot of overshoots and die-offs. So these are organisms that have a lot of offspring, in which many of them don't survive, and it's going to lead to reaching that carrying capacity quickly, overshooting it, and then having a large drop-off in terms of the organisms. So you can see here some traits in this table, and you can copy this down on your own time, that give you an idea of K-selected versus R-selective. The biggest ones being lifespan, number of offspring, size of the offspring, and in parental care are big determining factors when we're categorizing something as K or R-selected. Now, that's in terms of growth rate and reproductive strategy. So reproductive strategy is in terms of how these organisms are basically birthed and cared for, and we can also relate that to a survivorship curve. So you do need to know these three survivorship curves. They're important in studying ecology because they help us categorize organisms and make predictions based on what kind of organism it is, what kind of reproductive strategy it might have, to determine what kind of growth we might expect to see for that type of organism. So we said things like whales and people, we would be type 1, meaning that the majority of survivors, I should say the majority of organisms continue very long into old age before we start to see a drop-off in the number of organisms within a population. Basically means that these organisms can live a very long time. Type 1 is a good example of a K strategist with a very long lifespan. Type 3 is an example of an R strategist. So that's why we have the dandelion here, where a large number of organisms are born, but very few make it to some level of maturity. Very few organisms die off, usually because there's too many of them. There's just way too many to support based on these limiting resources. And because they have such short lifespans and such quick reproductive strategies, we end up with a quick turnover in terms of the organisms that are reproducing. You do have some organisms that fall in the middle here, these type 2. Type 2 tend to be organisms that are, the squirrel is a good example because basically as it gets older, its chances of dying stay pretty much the same. It just keeps increasing on top as it's a fairly constant change in terms of how many organisms survive as they reach old age. So they just kind of fall right in the middle. They would be somewhere between R and K strategists because we can't really group everything into two categories. But these organisms, we're talking about things that might have a litter, where some organisms will survive, most will survive to maturity, but then as these organisms get older, their chances of dying just keep increasing. So that's the first half of our lecture, which is talking about the actual population growth. Now, what determines some of the other factors that go into growth are going to be these interactions between organisms. So we know what competition is. So competition being the struggle of individuals to obtain a limiting resource. That will definitely impact population size and population growth. Now we have some examples here with paramecium data, which we're going to use in our virtual lab next week, so we won't focus on this too much. So one of the driving forces of competition, which should be a review from bio, but something we might not have been mentioned too much in your other classes, something called resource partitioning. Basically, when you have two organisms competing for a food source or competing for a resource, resource partitioning is basically a way to say, well, rather than competing for that one source, if you're the weaker competitor, you're going to basically try to occupy a niche where you're over time your species is going to hopefully move away from that competition with another species, the one that is better than you, that is more adapted, that is what we call more fit. So the example here is seed size for bird individuals. So species 1 is good at eating the small ones, species 2 is good at eating the big seeds, but species 1 is good at eating the medium-sized seeds as well. So since species 1 is better than species 2, it actually will occupy this niche even though there is overlap. So after many generations, species 1 will just feed on these smaller seeds and these middle seeds. Species 2 will only feed on the bigger ones in order to reduce its necessity to compete. And basically, so this one resource can be partitioned based on seed sizes from this one food source. Another level would be predation in terms of determining population size. So we have very different levels of predation. Basically, we call this where one species uses another as a resource. So when we think of true predation, it's predators killing their prey. We could also look at in ecological terms as herbivores consuming plants, parasites living on or in another organism, and parasitoids. All those are species interactions that involve one species using another as a resource. So we see here the owl eating the rat is true predator-prey relationship. The deer consuming the plant trees are consuming the leaves off the trees are herbivores eating their producers. Here we see worms coming out of this insect as a parasite. And here we see a parasitoid wasp. And the parasitoid, the only difference between a parasitoid and a parasite is that a parasitoid doesn't feed on the host. What it does is usually just use the host organism as a way to develop its young. So what this wasp is doing is injecting its fertilized eggs into this caterpillar, and the eggs will feed on the caterpillar during their maturity before they mature and basically break out on their own. The worms here were completely inside of this insect, cicada type looking organism, or grasshopper type looking organism that was totally feeding on the insides of this organism and using it to get its resources. There are other types of interactions that will determine population sizes, like mutualism, which you've probably heard of before, where we just have organisms interacting with one another where both are benefiting. So here we see the ants. The ants here on this plant species are able to, they get protection from these spiny thorns of this plant here, and the plants themselves are going to have some benefit as well. For the life of me, can't remember what this specific example was. We'll have to look it up and go over it in class a little bit more. Commensalism as well, where we have a relationship where one organism benefits but the other one isn't really harmed or affected. So a couple examples of this in this table you can copy down if you want to. The classic plus minus 0 for all of our species interactions. But we see the sharks here with the remoras. The remoras get the scraps. The sharks are not affected. We have a cattle egret here, which basically can pick bugs and stuff off of the cow. The cow has no benefit for that. And then we have our little Nemo type fish here in the anemone. The fish gets protection from the anemone because it doesn't get stung by it. The anemone really doesn't gain anything from the fish being there. So that's an example of commensalism. So when we talk about these communities and these populations, some species are more important to maintaining population sizes than others, and we call those a keystone species. So beaver and beaver dams are an example. Another good example we'll talk about in class are things like sea otters and sea urchins, sea otters in relation to sea urchins, things like jaguars and other top big, what we call big cats in their native environments. They play a very important role because if they are removed, not only does their population size affected by it for that one species, but it will also have a major effect on other population sizes as well. So we'll talk about these a little bit more in class, specifically how the beaver population, because of what beavers do in terms of damming up bodies of water, can have a large effect on many other species, both marine and land and terrestrial. So the last thing, as long as we're just make sure we're on our last thing here. So our last couple of pieces of information here are going to be talking about succession. So succession deals more with plants and reverts back to our case study in terms of population sizes. So how did these communities get started in order to have enough primary productivity to support all of these other organisms that are there? Plants don't just come from nowhere. So primary succession is the way that most of our original ecosystems began, where basically in areas that were initially devoid of soil eventually turn into these lush forested areas or anywhere in between. And you can see that it starts with exposed rock that things like lichens and mosses or lichens, however you want to pronounce it, can attach to, and they can start breaking down these rocks and during the process of photosynthesis and creating, and as they die, we get some soil and we get some things that can pile up on top here, just enough soil for smaller grasses to grow, and then the smaller grasses provide enough soil as they're dying and turning over and creating more and more layers to support larger shrubs, which eventually turn into younger trees and then broader trees. So this primary succession occurs in an area initially where there's nothing but rock. Secondary succession relates more to the case study, where we skip, the only difference is we skip the rocks in the moss phase because there's some soil already there, usually from either a previous forested area that was either, could have been burned down in a forest fire, or could have been harvested for timber or converted into farmland that's now not being touched at all by any kind of activity. Succession can also occur in things that in aquatic succession. So an example of aquatic succession would be if you had an open body of water that was, full of some, being disturbed consistently. An example like is a lake that is formed by a receding glacier. As the glacier is receding, there's too much activity going on in order for things to physically get planted here. But as it becomes an open water lake without any more inputs, we start to get grasses that die and accumulate sediment on the bottom and start to encroach on the size of the lake until eventually that lake basin will be filled over time, and grasses and shrubs and things can start to grow in that area. So the last thing we're going to talk about in terms of species population size is going to be the things that determine where we find all of these species. So things that determine species richness does kind of correlate to what we've been doing with biodiversity, but plays a bigger role when we talk about population size as well, where we're going to find all these species. So the things that we're going to mention are latitude, obviously more species near the equator. Time plays a role in establishing in these communities, because the ones that are in established habitats, more established habitats, things that have been around for maybe millions of years as opposed to thousands of years, will have more species in them, so that we can analyze. And again, more species means more interactions, more lines on that food web and in that community. Habitat size, a larger habitat is going to have the ability to support more species. And then distance from other species. So this is something that we look at with the island biogeography theory on the next slide, which is basically just that when we look at islands, something that was realized and as part of this theory is that if you look at something like an island, which is a remote area, they tend to have high amounts of biodiversity. But what determines why one island versus another might have more species richness? Well, the theory of island biogeography is that the islands closer to the mainland are going to have higher chance of immigration, and they tend to show that they do have a higher species richness, so more interactions within those communities. And obviously size, the larger islands can support more species. So when we're studying species richness and studying these things on islands, for example, things like the Galapagos, we can look to the ones that are closer to the actual mainland continent and look to the larger ones when we want to actually see species or areas that have a much higher species richness. So we did cut out a decent amount of information in terms of this lecture here, things that we'll go over in class a little bit more, but again, this covers the basics of the things that are in Chapter 6, and we will continue to go over some of this stuff and some of these things in class or in depth. So hopefully you have a nice weekend, enjoy, and see you all next time in class.